Hello, and welcome to Climate Fix Podcast. Here we dive into evidence-based solutions to climate change and various other pressing environmental issues. This is your co-host, DJ Leclerc.
And this is your co-host, Phil Ord. Warning, this podcast may challenge your views on environmentalism and push back on conventional environmental thought with science and data. We hope you approach with humanism and an open mind.
This podcast is created by Americans for Nuclear Energy, A&E, a pro-nuclear environmental organization. We take no money from industry or special interest groups. All donations are from individuals like you, interested in a grassroots scientific movement to solve the world's most pressing scientific problem, global climate change.
Our mission statement is as follows. Nuclear energy is safe, cheap, plentiful, clean, and efficient. It has the capability to stop and reverse climate change while addressing the ever-growing demand for electricity globally. We strive to educate American citizens about this technology and to dispel misconceptions with facts. We firmly believe that both human civilization and industrialism can easily coexist with a healthy environment.
Join us in helping to plan a prescription for a feverish planet, or as we like to say, a climate fix.
So thanks for joining us. We're going to talk about the Green New Deal, and my co-host, DJ Leclerc, and our podcast producer, Jona. She's not been on this podcast before, so I'll let her introduce herself.
Yeah, hi, this is Jona, and I am a big-time advocate of nuclear energy. I believe that nuclear energy is the absolute best track for solving climate change and being the next generation of energy for the entire world economy.
And I feel like we should also mention that that you also you do some recording for some music as well, right?
That's right. I have a SoundCloud, and I produce music, write music. I work with local artists. It's more of a hobby at this point, but maybe someday it will become something I get paid to do if I'm lucky. But if not, it's still fun. I'm, definitely fascinated with the whole Green New Deal and the whole politics around it. I think in the pro-nuclear community, we're kind of frustrated. I know I am personally, because nowhere in the Green New Deal does it specifically say nuclear energy is, going to be even a part of it. There's some flirting with it when they use language like 100% carbon neutral, but it's definitely not able to cross over the line and say, hey, we think nuclear energy should be a part of the solution. I've done a little bit of research on the Green New Deal, because one thing that's maybe not quite genuine about it is that it's being portrayed as something that's AOC had written, which is not exactly the case. Its origins date back to 2008. It was...
Sorry to bother you, but can you explain who AOC is?
Cortez. I call her Cortez. The new...
Andrea.
The new representative, that's on the news every day now.
Kind of the darling of the left.
She's the new star of the left, and they're kind of using her upward mobility in the media landscape to tack on the Green New Deal. But the Green New Deal has origins that go as far back in time as 2008, which is 11 years ago almost.
Wow, I was not aware of that.
Yeah, it was originally written by a guy named Larry Elliott, and it was published in this thing called the New Economics Foundation. I'm just looking at the Wikipedia. I can read it. It says the Green New Deal was reported to be released on July 21st, 2008 by the Green New Deal Group, published by the New Economics Foundation, which outlines a series of policy proposals to tackle global warming and the current financial crisis. At the time, there was the big housing crash and things like that. And what they were perceiving at the time is the peak oil boom decline. Peak oil means that they were thinking at the time that this was we hit the maximum output for crude oil worldwide. This is before fracking.
I was about to say, this was before fracking really hit.
The Green New Deal was completely focused on renewable energies as the cornerstone and alternative to fossil fuel. The problem with this whole narrative that pretty much the entire world, at least the side of the world that cares about climate change, is that it's so in love with solar and wind and so closed off to any other option that they're not leaving any other option, I guess is the problem.
Yeah, and it's interesting because they're using a, environmental issue that needs to be solved rapidly to propose kind of a big fix to society somehow. For example, of course, it's called the Green New Deal. It's modeled after FDR's New Deal, which was needed to lift a lot of people out of the Great Depression. And right now, there are economic issues, yes, but we aren't in a depression. And would a New Deal type, jobs program be productive? Is it adding value to people's lives? Is it going to make us wealthy somehow? I'm skeptical of that.
Yeah, basically, I mean, most people that are into economics right now would say that there's probably never been a time in American history when the economy has been stronger. If you look over at the fossil fuel industry right now in the United States, the fossil fuel industry has never been stronger as in output. The United States is now a net exporter of fossil fuel, liquid natural gas, and oil, and coal. And a big part of the reason why this country is doing so well economically at this point is because the abundance of fossil energy, and it's cheap.
It's kind of depressing to think about, actually.
Well, the good news is this: make energy even cheaper than fossil fuel will ever hope to be.
And that's with the incredible power of the atom, of course. 2 million times more energy dense than a hydrocarbon bond with zero of the emissions.
I completely agree. And what's interesting is, I know this is a little bit of a sidetrack here, but the nuclear industry as a whole, they have goals of reducing their costs by 25-30%, and they've been actually quite successful in doing that. I personally work side by side with some of them, and seeing that they have definitely reduced prices. So this could make it to where I think it pushes nuclear to be even cheaper, because they need to compete with those cheap fossil fuels. Well,
should we jump into some of the points of the draft legislation?
Sounds good to me.
Before we do, I'd kind of like to just point one other thing out. And
Sure.
I think it's super important for anyone listening, is that the entire philosophy around solving climate change has only been focused on one part of our energy consumerism, which is the electric grid, which is significant. It's nothing to discount. It's about 25% of our total energy usage, depending on how you want to splice that out, but roughly around 25%. But what's frustrating to me is that by only focusing on the electric grid, you're completely ignoring the other 75% of the carbon footprint. So that would be basically transportation and industry.
Yeah, and we kind of get into some of that. And especially for things like transportation, some of the ideas in the Green New Deal are kind of wild and really aren't realistic in the least. But anyway, basically the entire legislation says we need to move away from, a carbon-based energy system with 100% quotes renewable energy. And they don't realize that that's really just for the electric grid, like wind and solar. I mean, how are you going to drive a car with that? We can go electric, but, that's billions of cars we'd have to change over, and they talk about the IPCC report that came out where they, basically ask, we should probably try to have our global emissions by 2030, which is 12 years, and eventually get it to zero by 2050. And they say that this will help keep the average global temperatures from rising above 1.5 degrees Celsius. And, we definitely believe climate change is a huge issue. How do we know if that timeline's correct? I mean, is that even realistic? I'm just trying to be honest here. I think we'll be lucky if we really try to get emissions to zero by 2100. I don't know what you guys think. Just thoughts on that. DJ, what do you think?
So recently, I think was it Ben Hurd that came out with a article recently.
Can you describe who Ben Hurd is again?
Yes, Ben Hurd. He's from Australia. He is a big advocate for nuclear energy and the eco-modernism philosophy, which we won't get too deep in what that is, but he was talking about the deadline fallacy, which I really do think it is very important that we decarbonize as fast as possible. And a lot of people, they give that whole deadline thing and say, hey, we can't do nuclear plants. And then they cherry pick specific ones that have taken a long time to build and say, look, it takes 15 years to build a nuclear plant, which is completely false. But they try to put that deadline on there, and it just makes people think, oh, well, we can't do nuclear because it takes too long to make that 12-year half of our emissions gone thing. But actually, nuclear has been proven to decarbonize quite quickly.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, if listeners want an example, you look at France. France decarbonized their entire electric sector, up to about 90% in less than 30 years with nuclear power and hydro.
Much less than that.
One thing in defense of the Green New Deal, in relation to France, is that when France did that, they didn't do it with private investors. That was completely a government-led effort to build out their electric grid on nuclear energy.
It was just a mass mobilization of intense amounts of
government
public
money
and private money. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But there was an intense amount of government leadership involved in that.
So are you saying in defense of the Green New Deal that we do need something like that in order, or is that kind of what we're actually going to talk later on about our idea of what a good Green New Deal is, but is that kind of what you're saying?
Ideally, some reactor comes out that's just such an amazing moneymaker that everyone wants a piece of, but realistically, that's probably not going to happen, at least not at first. And if we can offload some of the risk investment onto the government, it would definitely accelerate, the expansion of new nuclear technology. Absolutely.
Yeah, it would be great if the public sector, aka the government, could help with the R&D so we can get these reactor costs very low and very safe. So there's no reason why people would burn coal anymore, right?
Economics drives everything.
Right.
No one likes to deal with this reality. Going to buy gas, and you've got a choice of 4 gas stations, and they're all pretty much just as easy to get to. Chances are you're going to pick the one that charges the least amount. That's just common sense.
This has got me thinking. Right now, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's windmills everywhere. There's solar being built everywhere, which many people will point out the mass so-called investment in massive amounts of wind and solar. In my opinion, or not even my opinion, the facts show that the government's actually kind of leading that when it comes to subsidies and everything. So it really gives incentive for utilities to build those things. I'm curious on what happens if we were doing the same thing, except for also including nuclear in that. Would we see massive investment towards nuclear?
Yeah, let's move on just a little bit. The frequently asked questions of the Green New Deal that put out, one of the questions was, is nuclear going to be part of this? And they pretty much dismiss it and say, we'd like to get rid of it. We'd like to, if we can, close them down. But if we can't, then I guess we'll move that down the road. But it says adding more nuclear to the conversation isn't part of the strategy. And that just makes zero sense to me, because 2/3 of our carbon-free electricity in the United States is nuclear. If we get rid of that, place it, try wind and solar, which will be a lot harder to do because it's intermittent, how is that a climate strategy in the least?
Well, it's a totally terrible strategy. Number one, another thing that people are not conscious of at this point, the hamburger meme kind of alludes to it.
Can you explain what that is?
The argument is, don't eat beef because there's a huge carbon footprint in the beef. And that's fine. If you don't want to eat beef, don't eat beef. But you're also ignoring the bun. You're ignoring the tomato. You're ignoring the mayonnaise, the lettuce. Sure, maybe per pound or whatever, it has a lower carbon footprint, but it has a carbon footprint. If you take that bun and you break down all the ingredients, you've got flour, salt, probably baking soda, eggs, etc. You take one ingredient, like flour. Well, that flour has a carbon footprint. That flour started as a piece of wheat in a field. The tractor driving, on gas, powered on gas, harvested the wheat, put it into this big bin, and then they truck it off, and then they...
Behind every consumer good, there's just mass quantities of energy behind it because of the global economic system.
So ditching the burger or the beef in the burger for some other substitute, you're only shaving a small percentage of your carbon footprint. So I think what people are aware that they create a carbon footprint when they get in their car and they drive, when they jump on an airplane and fly somewhere, or when they turn on a light switch. But they don't think, hey, I'm creating a carbon footprint when they go buy a new TV. They don't think, hey, I'm generating a carbon footprint just making dinner.
Which is why it's so important that we actually replace our fossil fuel with a affordable carbon-free source. And because that way you can power all of these things without emitting greenhouse gas.
And the other thing, too, that no one's really putting into their climate change calculator is that when you start, if we're talking about building billions and billions of dollars worth of hardware, solar panels, windmills, that's a carbon footprint investment we're making. So, if you want to build a wind turbine, has anybody ever seen like a full-size wind turbine in real life? Or even just like a component of it?
Gosh, they're freaking huge.
They're amazingly huge. Like just one blade has to go on this like very long truck. And there's a huge amount of steel going into this stuff. And
the carbon behind all these goods, we could do a whole podcast about that for sure.
But the bottom line is that, it's kind of like digging a hole when somebody's standing at the top of the hole with a shovel throwing dirt back into the hole, that you're kind of working against yourself. And that's kind of what we're doing with this idea of this like multi-billion, even trillion-dollar solar wind build out is like, hey, we're gonna stop climate change by reducing our carbon footprint, but first we're gonna create a huge carbon footprint.
Exactly, because you need the fossil fuel to build the renewables.
Right.
So,
and then you have to factor that into your if you want to put a carbon tax. You want to raise the price of fossil fuel, well, guess what? You're going to raise the price of the manufacturing of your solar and your windmills. Unless, of course, you offshore your manufacturing to a place like China.
Let me move to another part of it. And this has gotten a lot of laughs in the media about ending air travel or trying to build up high-speed rail so we don't have to fly in airplanes anymore. And, that sounds reasonable, but if you get down and think about it, trains at best go, with the best in Japan, it goes 300 kilometers an hour, and that's the best one they have. And we're thinking we're going to do that for all over the United States when you can jump on an airplane and go 600 miles an hour. It's just absurd to think that we are going to stop using airplanes or jet travel because it's fast and cheap. And to be honest, America is pretty sparsely populated for having 300 million people that it makes no sense to have these long distance rail lines. That works better in places like Europe where cities aren't that far apart. And, how are we going to electrify that? So I don't know. DJ, do you have any thoughts on that?
The whole fact that this is all very, very unrealistic and pie in the sky. I know that's been used a lot out there, but it really is, because they've added in so many other things besides just doing your high-speed trains and everything, which everything sounds so rainbows and unicorns. They're trying to fix everything in one thing, such as giving jobs to everybody, even though we have really low unemployment. Not to say that everybody's getting paid very well, but there's plenty of jobs right now, and they're really looking to fix social issues, and there's a lot of language in there that it's just, and it's very partisan too. So it makes me feel like it's kind of a unrealistic, like they don't really want to fix climate change and fix our emissions problem is kind of the feeling that I get from it. I don't know about you all, what you all think about that, but it just doesn't feel like a serious thing.
A fix for climate change is not going to be, it should only be focused on the actual technology and how the technology is going to affect the economy. I mean, really, it's almost like they put the cart in front of the horse. Like, I
just want to mention that there is a way to decarbonize air travel, and that's called synthetic fuel. With a high energy source of power like nuclear that's carbon free, you can actually undo the combustion reaction of jet fuel and essentially pull the carbon dioxide out of the air and mix that with hydrogen, and it produces, jet fuel and oxygen as a byproduct.
If people want to look back in our archives, we had a nice podcast exactly on this. Just a little plug there.
Exactly. So we can decarbonize things like jet travel. Going backwards and saying we need to reduce it that's not. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say. But Jona, I'll let you.
I really just feel it's unfortunate that something as important as climate change has been so heavily politicized on both sides. A big part of the problem has been, from climate change denial, and it's like we can't even begin to approach on a national level how to solve a problem, until we first acknowledge that there is a problem. So we're starting to see a shift on the right, where they're slowly starting to acknowledge that this is a real problem. I think it's probably because there's more and increasingly scary signs. And if anybody isn't highly concerned or downright scared right now, they're not paying attention. Anybody who's really paying attention to what's happening in terms of climate, you should be freaking out.
Every year being hotter than the last is a very bad omen, in my opinion. And, people will say, oh, well, we're getting these polar vortexes and stuff. Well, on average, the climate globally is getting warmer and all that.
Polar vortex issue is a destabilization of the jet stream in the Arctic. So it's kind of like, if somebody comes up and smacks your hat off. Your hat, just goes flying off in some place where it doesn't belong. It belongs on your head. And that cold air is kind of like Earth's hat.
Yep.
And there's a bunch of hot air, rushing up to the Arctic, and it's kind of throwing the whole thing off balance. It's spreading the cold air all over the place, but it's also it's also telling us is that there's more warm air up in the Arctic where cold air isn't where it's supposed to be.
And this science should be the root of the discussion, but in this Green New Deal legislation, they're saying we need to give everyone a livable wage. I agree. I agree we need that, but they want to fix wage stagnation. Well, I don't really know what that has to do with the polar vortex. And they say fix income inequality for every demographic and, make sure there aren't any pay disparities. Again, I don't know what that has to do with the parts per million of carbon dioxide that's shooting up. And I mean, sorry to be a little bit kind of sarcastic here. They even say things like reconcile and fix all past, current, and future oppression. I'm all about trying to alleviate some of the, major social issues of the day, but emissions are the priority. That's just what I think.
Some perspective. I think most Americans, there's a lot of language that revolves around the idea of privilege, but what most Americans don't realize is that just being an American is, in a way, sort of a privilege. If you make more than $25,000 a year, you are in the upper 4% of the world population in terms of wealth. I mean, just think about that for a second. If you make $25,000, that's poverty level in the United States. That's what you basically consider the poverty line, is right around there. But if you're at 25,000, you're actually richer than 96% of the rest of the world population. The reason why the United States is more wealthy than most other countries in the world is our ability to consume energy. There is a direct correlation between how much energy a country consumes and how wealthy it is. And if you really think about it, it's not too hard to figure out why. If you want to go to a hospital, that hospital didn't just magically appear. It was built with machines, and those machines run on energy. And the more expensive the energy is, the more expensive it is to build the machines to build hospitals, and the more expensive it is to build the hospital. Everything relates to the cost of energy. So when their idea says, hey, let's raise the cost of energy and we want all this extra stuff, you're kind of like pulling the economy in two separate directions. You're telling everybody that we need to work with less energy and somehow get more out of it. So I think the secret sauce here, again, is if you want more stuff, more wealth in our economy, because everything costs something. Education costs something. Healthcare costs something. We have to have a way to pay for it. We get more money by simply getting more energy into the country.
Yeah, and this is actually a pretty good segue into kind of one of the other points of the Green New Deal. You bring up a good point. People assume that, okay, well, maybe make electricity or energy more scarce, and then that'll lead us to use less fossil fuel. And a way to do that is kind of absorb those costs is to increase your efficiency. And interestingly enough, or in most climate policies, energy efficiency is a key part of it. And I tend to agree.
Not wasting energy is certainly important, but it's not going to be. We're talking, small percentages.
Green New Deal asks to literally upgrade every single building with state-of-the-art efficiency, and honestly, efficiency. DJ, you'd agree. Efficiency is just part of the game. It's everyone wants to save money, right?
Absolutely. Like, I'm all for energy efficiency. Like, I don't want to be, throwing my money out the window because of all that heat that I'm wasting. So, I mean, energy efficiency is great because I want to save money. But you know what I'm going to do with that money when I save it? I'm going to go spend it. Just like Jona said, I'm going to go spend it on a TV. I'm going to spend it on finally taking a vacation with my wife to the Caribbean or something. All of those things that I'm saving my money on energy efficiency, but I'm going to spend it somewhere else, and I'm going to use energy, and that gets us into Jevon's paradox, which you're saving, or you're being more efficient, can actually lead to you just shifting where you're making that carbon footprint, and in some cases can have a backfire effect where it makes things even worse, because you saved money on energy, and now you're going to go spend money on a vacation, maybe a little more money than you saved on the energy efficiency. And it's not just vacations; that's just an example. But
and the jet fuel from that vacation could offset an entire year of energy savings, and there's just an upper limit to how much you can do. And really, it goes back to, we just need to clean up our power. And well, let me just go talk about Jevon's paradox really quick, or economic realities. But the more you save energy, the more uses you have for it. And if we're going to be more efficient, that just opens up for us to splurge on other things, like DJ said, new items. And so it's kind of a paradox where how much energy we use, really, the problem is where we get our energy from. And basically says is, for some things, the more you use the more you save something, the more you can end up, consuming with it, if that makes sense to people listening.
Also, with that same paradox, let's say, for example, the United States instituted a 25% tax on fossil fuel, and the economy, the economists here can look at this and go, oh, look, we've reduced our fossil fuel because we've artificially raised the price of it. The problem with this is that we operate in a global market. So if we're artificially raising the price of energy here in this country, all you're going to do is open up the market in a different part of the world that's developing, where they don't have those taxes.
Yeah, have you heard of the idea of innovating to zero? DJ, have you heard of that?
I have not.
But it's basically the idea that we must get clean energy, zero emissions. We must get the price down to that of below coal, because otherwise, like Jona says, a developing country is going to do whatever's cheapest. And that's their right, because they need to leave poverty and they need access to energy however they can get it. So, maybe a carbon tax might work in a developed country, but, that could just pass the carbon emissions on to the developing countries. So just wanted to say that. But do you guys want to get into kind of the stuff they say about agriculture? Or
Absolutely. Let's see here. Oh, yes. It talks about beef and cattle reducing our emissions from that. Actually, Phil, I want to kind of push back. I think you might be actually able to talk about this a little better than me.
All right. Yeah. So I did a paper in college about climate change, in a class about climate change. And I've always been hearing that like beef has a big carbon footprint, and I wanted to look at why and some evidence behind it. And it's because the cow's digestive system is called a ruminant system. And in order to glean calories from the grass, which humans can't digest very well because it's made out of this stuff called cellulose, they need to use bacteria to ferment the grass or the grains, and part of that fermentation process produces methane, or we also call natural gas. And it's literally the burps, not the farts, the burps of cows that can actually, it does increase your carbon emissions, because methane's a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So when she says, "Oh, we need to limit cow farts," or not, when the Green New Deal literally talks about cow farts, they're not wrong. They're not wrong. And honestly, if you look at the profiles of different sources of protein, beef is sky high when it comes to the amount of feed you need to use and the amount of methane the cows produce. If you just switch to, I think in this paper I wrote back in the day, it's like if you switch to just pork, you could your carbon emissions would be like 1/6 in life cycle assessment of beef. So honestly, I think we should perhaps look to a potential pollution fee on beef, because there's plenty of other great meats out there. And, if beef is the one that's causing such a environmental issue, I mean, we somehow need to penalize that. That's just my opinion. And
have you heard any difference between the methane release from cattle feed versus just green grass?
It's essentially the same.
Okay.
They use grain just because it's easier to grow,
right,
and transport. I mean, cows will eat hay too, but I'm not sure why they use corn. I think it's just because it's just more calories per unit. It's more calories per unit, but still
maybe
they can.
Somebody's listening here. They could correct us on that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm no expert. It's just, should we talk about how, Jona, you might like to talk about this, but because you talk about kind of global energy uses, but it talks about going to like local production of food to limit carbon emissions. Can you perhaps explain what the fallacy is in that?
Yeah, I mean, everybody hates it. Everyone would hate it. I live in Oregon, which is a great agricultural area. We've got a lot of potatoes and nuts, and there's some other bumper crops. Apples is really big here. So those are all great, but, everyone loves a banana. People love their fruits from around the world, and so...
And if I couldn't give my kids bananas, oh my gosh.
I think it's a lot easier said than done just to stick with local only, until they come up with some sort of super amazing way to do indoor agriculture on a scale that's, where you're able to feed millions of people. It's...
And in places that have harsh winters, are we going to go back to the old days where we pickle our vegetables and just try to survive off of, dried foodstuffs? No, people want their fresh salad. That might have to come from Chile or Israel, and all these different foods are from all over the earth, and you need these supply chains. And to say, oh, we need local food production instead, well, that's going to actually increase costs. That might actually increase emissions in some ways, because it might be cheaper to buy something wholesale from one part of the world than to grow more of it where you live it's a very complicated system, and the idea of we'll just go back to kind of communal gardening for sustenance is it's just, again, it's not based
very realistic.
Right.
I mean, if we want to just kind of go down that road the whole way of let's just do less of everything, we would literally just have to go back to like the Dark Ages. So we would have to accept that, definitely kiss free healthcare goodbye, get rid of the whole idea of having public education. If we're going to shrink our economy, get used to not having jobs and just eating dirt, and we'll just go back, to
subsistence.
We'll just go back to the Dark Ages,
which some people
ride horses around
was
and
better
because it was more natural.
When you get a disease, you'll just suck it up. When you're 35, you're old.
Right, we don't realize how amazing our lives are until it's gone.
Because of energy.
Who wants to go chop wood to heat their house? That's backbreaking and terrible. And
I would much rather live in a world where, hey, let's go have lunch in Paris and then dinner in Tokyo. Because, and literally the trip like takes like a half hour to get to Paris because you're skipping through, outer space to get there. If we want to get to the next, the next level of society, we can't be looking towards the past for answers. We have to look towards the future. And, clearly, because of physics, nuclear is the future of the economy. It's just a matter of how we get there.
Just based on the simple energy density alone.
200 years from now, if there's survivors, they're going to be surviving on nuclear energy, whoever they are.
For sure.
Survivors.
They're the only survivors.
Just in an underground nuclear facility that can survive the absolute Martian conditions.
Yeah, I really think we should do another episode just on hot house Earth.
No, right? Just kind of the potential bad places things can go if we aren't careful. Just one last thing about agriculture. There's a documentary called Cowspiracy everyone talks about. And it talks about how animal agriculture has a large carbon footprint, and that's very much true. But sometimes they're a little bit sneaky about it because they group in like land use change, like cutting down trees for pasture land, and that's not necessarily the animals doing it. And plus, eventually, that'll kind of tap out once populations start decreasing again, which they're projected to. But they also group in the transport fuel, like the gasoline and the diesel and the fuel for the combines and the farm equipment. And that would be very hard to electrify. I can't imagine a battery-powered combine that could plow a field all day, every day for, 2 weeks of harvest. And again, back to the synthetic fuel thing, we can decarbonize the fuel for these machines. And again, I'm very passionate about synthetic fuel, but I just thought I'd mention that. And let's just not also forget that genetic modification can also decrease the carbon footprint of these crops because you don't have to turn the fields as much. You don't have to weed as much, and they can use less water and less fertilizer. It's amazing what GMOs can do to
less pesticides.
Yeah, exactly.
They have already from producing crops,
just per unit. Well, do you want to talk about the cost, DJ?
Yeah. So one thing that it mentions having more jobs, right? when you're trying to, you don't want to transition into an energy system that requires more jobs, because if it's using more jobs, that means it's way more expensive. And the estimates have come out for by the way, expenses, 51 trillion to 97 trillion for the Green New Deal.
As it stands now.
As it stands now, yes. I remember my dad, he came up with the analogy of it's like you have this money and you're just paying people to dig a hole and put the dirt in a pile, and then you have other people take that dirt and fill that hole back in. Basically, you're just using a bunch of people and you're just increasing costs, yet you're not really anything useful, because you could instead invest in, say, nuclear energy, which is a significantly lower price. I've seen more like 4 trillion to, I want to say, just less than 10 for completely going nuclear instead. So it's like, do we try to go the Green New Deal route and maybe create a bunch of jobs? But why? We're just increasing the cost, and we obviously talked about this earlier. Jona was talking about it. Increasing costs is not good.
If you guys want to know where we got some of those figures, that 51 trillion to 97 trillion was in Fortune magazine, and it's from a center-right policy think tank called American Action Forum. And I looked up a source watch, and it said they were pretty factual. So don't take our word for that, and look it up. And the nuclear grid cost, which was, I think, between $3 to $9 trillion, depending on how cheap nuclear you can get it. And with new technology, that was done by my friend Mike Conley and Tim Maloney, two progressive pro-nuclear advocates and engineers, and they kind of pieced together a nuclear transformation in their book called Roadmap to Nowhere. I suggest you guys, those listening, check it out. It's free online, and they do a great job. Just saying. And one last thing about the jobs issue. I mean, throughout history, like in the old days, you would have a lot of people working on energy production. Like, imagine all the labor you would need to collect firewood and bring it into town to run your smelter, stuff like that. And throughout history, our basic necessities are taking less and less people to provide as technology increases. Like, an example would be most of the agricultural revolution. 90 to 95% of all people just toiled on the land. In the United States, the amount of farmers is 1 to 2%. I think it's less than 1%. And that's exactly how energy is going to go. We have these centralized power plants that can burn gas and coal and take only a few employees. And ironically, we want to have less jobs for energy and not more to make the economy more sound. It's kind of counterintuitive,
Well, these are also, the renewable economy job fantasy they're a bunch of crappy jobs. I've met somebody who actually goes out and services windmills. He gets paid to go around to different areas of the country and do this, and it's dangerous. You have to drive up to the base of it, and there's a little door, and then you crawl inside. And you get inside, you've got this ladder.
40-minute walk up.
Yeah, and you have to clip in. So every time you got to step up and clip in. But they're also put on a time schedule. So they have a certain number that they're supposed to hit in a certain day. So what a lot of them end up doing is not clipping in. They're just like, I'm just going to charge up this thing. So it's very common in this industry that people come tumbling down that ladder full force, and they hit the bottom and they're dead.
Ironically, both wind and solar are more dangerous than nuclear.
Right. So, the idea that we're going to make this like the number one job in America of crawling up these crappy ladders, and somehow that's a good thing, that's a terrible thing. Another job that will be needed is someone to go out there and literally wipe solar panels down. You've got dust that collects.
for those that I've heard, they even have to use distilled water, or they call deionized water, to rinse these things off, because if you have hard water buildup, it can decrease your efficiencies, noticeably of your solar panels. Solar panels only work optimally when there's not a cloud in the sky, the sun's directly overhead, and the solar panels are crystal clean. You see some of these solar arrays in the desert covered with dust on pictures and stuff. Those solar panels like that are producing no electricity. It drops off dramatically. Mm-hmm. So solar panels, people think it's the panacea of energy, but they're really crappy, and sunlight's relatively dilute,
Yeah, solar and wind are just so completely oversold. I mean, it's not going to solve climate change. It's not even going to breach the growth demand for energy worldwide. So what I'm saying is, if we add, let's say, 5% more solar and wind renewable energy to our grid, it's not even going to come close to the amount of energy demand that's increasing every single year. So if we can add 5 here in this country, worldwide, the energy demand is going to be more than that amount. So it's not even a real plan to keep things as bad as they are now. Like, things are still going to get worse and worse and worse. It's such a horrible plan to solve climate change, and I think people have just been lied to. At this point, it's hard for me to look at all of these extremely smart world leaders all over the world who all seem to fully buy into this idea that solar and wind are going to solve climate change when it's so obvious that it won't.
Make a disclaimer that we aren't anti-solar and wind. We're anti-solutions that just aren't actually making a difference. Yeah.
Right.
And in my perfect world, and this is kind of our last talking point where we're all gonna share what we think is the best way to do it. Wind and solar need to compete in the price per unit energy produced with zero emissions. And if that's how we regulated or added value to our energy system based on the actual, emissions avoided per technology, nuclear would win. It just would. Wind and solar I would be outcompeted. And I'm not saying those technologies aren't valid in certain applications, but we can't just say, oh, we want it because it sounds good. It needs to actually produce the results we need. I know I get a little bit passionate about that, but we aren't necessarily anti-renewables, but we are very skeptical of the role they'll play.
I look at it like this. If you have 2 employees, right, or 2 people who are hiring in for a position, let's just say, for example, that they're both equally potentially good at this job, but the one, it wants 4 times the salary of the other. Obviously the cheaper one is going to be the better deal. But then when you compound that with the one wants 4 times as much and wants to do a quarter of the work that the other one can do all the work for a cheaper amount, that's obviously the one that you want to hire. And that's kind of the difference in these technologies. Wind and solar, solar does not work at night. A lot of people really don't understand that. They truly don't. I've spoken with so many on the internet, it's ridiculous. Like, it's genuinely a news thing to them. Like, they really don't understand that solar panels don't work when it's dark out or when there's a shade or a shadow over it. Like, that's news to them. So, that's the kind of what we're dealing with out in the general public. And then people think, well, let's just get batteries. Okay, there's another
the battery fallacy.
The battery fallacy. There are no batteries that are big enough. A city is not your cell phone. It's
exactly. It's
a cell phone is a very low voltage thing. It's completely designed to work on the minimum amount of electricity, so it can fit into your pocket. That's not going to.
And storing energy is very difficult. It has to do with just physics, because every time you change the energy from one form to another, you will always lose a significant percentage of it in terms of heat loss, and that's what we call thermodynamics. And
Yeah, definitely. Especially when you're converting between electrical energy and chemical energy. When you're talking about the batteries that would be used for solar and wind, and then it's better if maybe you had something that was thermal, and in keeping it as thermal energy.
It takes like 10 watts of power out of your wall to charge a cell phone, roughly. And then the phone actually holds about a half a watt. That's how lithium ion works for your cell phone. It takes about
it doesn't hold a watt. It would hold
a half. It holds about a half a watt, but it takes about 10 to charge it. So that means that you're losing a significant amount to heat.
Do you mean watt hours? Sorry,
yes,
just
watt
a
hours.
Minor correction there.
Yeah, and basically it's best to use energy when you produce it. And that's what's good about nuclear and, unfortunately, fossil fuels is you can turn them on when you want them. And there's no other technology we have that can do that except hydro if you have enough in your reservoir. But sometimes, especially with the climate variations that we're going to face, we might not have access to water anytime we want. So we kind of maybe talk a little bit too much about this, but back to kind of the cost issue, you know, I think one regulation that might work, even though it would be politically bad and politically hard to do, and it would probably outsource carbon emissions to other countries, but it's called a carbon fee. Basically, the idea is that we have a very slowly increasing price on carbon that you would then take that revenue and give back to everybody in a dividend. And basically, energy generators could look into the future and be like, okay, it's going to get very expensive if we keep burning our fossil plants. Maybe we should move to a cheaper option. And I don't know what you guys think about that, but that's kind of what a lot of the climate scientists think we should do. And
there's already a gasoline tax. I'm pretty sure there's a tax on LNG, and I'm not sure about coal. But there's also taxes when you pump it out of the ground for all the above. The government already charges that. And then things get a little bit murky when they start drilling on public land. It's like, well, because they're supposed to pay into the public coffers when they're, dipping into public. So they're supposed to be charged a certain amount, and then I think that's where the things get fuzzy with the whole, what do you call it? The subsidies, yes.
Oh,
so
right.
that's some things that so some of those discounts are considered subsidies. So it is a little bit complicated because you're getting into this like accounting stuff. But the fact of the matter is that we already do tax our carbon. I'm not completely opposed to adding a little bit more, but there is a danger to adding too much because then you start to hurt the overall economy. And there's no way we're going to tackle climate change with a weak economy. It's just not going to work.
Right. We have to be pretty careful with the economic issues because if you increase the price of energy, you can really do some damage to the economy. So you have to be pretty careful. So, I mean, a lot of us nuclear folks believe that we're just going to have to try to innovate our way out of this. But let's kind of wrap up here and we'll just go around and let's all share what we think would be a better Green New Deal or a better plan or a green nuclear deal, if you will. DJ, we'll start with you.
Okay. So, I mean, I know people are talking about like it needs to be big, right? Because so far we're not getting anywhere, right? So in my opinion, like a good new Green Deal would be one where we're going kind of like the Apollo moonshot. That's kind of been used a lot, but for one thing, you're kind of creating a task force that you're digging into the real science, the not politicized stuff, and you're actually like bringing in experts on energy economics. You bring in experts on synthesized fuel that's essentially zero emissions or low emissions, and you bring in everybody together and kind of try getting that Apollo moonshot. Or I like to think about like the Manhattan Project, where they brought in experts and basically just made it happen. I know that's probably not a wise thing to talk about, but or to allude to, but an army
of experts.
Yeah, and people that are not just have that partisan political thing, but people who want to actually solve it and aren't led by ideology, and just get the science. Like make a deal that, sure, you can leave it. This is my opinion. You could leave it to be neutral when it comes to where the energy comes from, as long as it's clean energy. And obviously
safe.
Stay focused on the energy, yes, and safe, and bring in the experts to figure it all out for you, but basically set that into motion is kind of that's my thought about it.
So I've become more fascinated with just kind of market mechanisms, and I do think a way out of this mess is to compete our way out, and that's why I think the only way to do this is some sort of, if the government was to do anything, which is hard to get the government to do something, let alone the right thing that works, is the carbon fee and dividend. Is you would slowly ratchet up the cost of polluting carbon dioxide, because you shouldn't be able to pollute for free. That's everyone else's space, and that violates other people's rights. And the idea is, in my mind, we would get rid of all the subsidies of power, even for nuclear, even for fossil fuels, and even for renewables. And we would get rid of all the tax credits, no government money to give you a free money to a Tesla, which I think is fairly unfair. And, get rid of these, quotes, renewable mandates that blatantly exclude technology like nuclear and potential carbon capture. If you get rid of all of those things, you set a floor. And then if you institute that carbon fee and dividend, it would then basically cause a technological race. And whoever can find the cheapest, safest, and most abundant carbon-free power would win. And nuclear power checks every single one of those boxes. And I think it would come out as the winner. I honestly think it would make it so wind and solar are just not worth our time. But, that's my bias. That's how I think we can solve it. And I think it's going to take a technological arms race to get, again, innovate to zero. Get the cost below that of coal. So all other countries will use it by default, because it makes no sense to spend extra money. But that's kind of my thing. But I like DJ's idea where it's like, get a huge team of people that just says, you guys figure out how to decarbonize everything and come up with a plan. That's my 2 cents anyway.
I would definitely like the Manhattan style ambition, but I think that there's already some good plans on the drawing board, and that we already have good plans that are being funded by the government. Lithium comes to mind. I really like that reactor because it's kind of like a garbage disposal for nuclear waste. Pretty much you can throw anything into it. And I'm pretty sure, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's mass producible. But it's critical that we come up with a reactor design, it's mass producible, and government fund it.
Safe.
And you get these things pumping out on an assembly line as quickly as possible and distributed all over the United States. And then once the government makes that investment, sets the ball rolling, then they can privatize it at that point. They can sell it off to investors. They can walk away from it. So I think the government should build a huge nuclear infrastructure and then sell it off to the public, And then hopefully we can even make a little bit of money and then pay down some of our debt. But that's going beyond the real focus here. But yeah, I think the government should just go completely bonkers. And then if anybody wants to make solar panels and windmills off of nuclear energy, go for it, because it's actually going to be a zero carbon technology at that point. But until until you're manufacturing solar and wind off of nuclear energy, you're just creating more of a problem. And any of this other stuff is just adding more to the climate change issue.
We need to get back to this critical analysis, cost-benefit analysis and critical thinking and the scientific method to get us out of this existential threat we're facing. Because honestly, I view it as like an asteroid's heading towards us. And, things can get very, very ugly if we don't do things exactly right. So, ideology needs to go out the window. Tribalism needs to go out the window. We need to cooperate, and we need to come up with, leave all ideas on the table.
We need to think of climate change like it's an alien invasion or an asteroid or World War II. It's time to buck up and really take this thing seriously, because if we don't, it's going to get so sad.
Anything else you want to say, DJ? Or
it's funny, in my mind I'm thinking about the Independence Day speech. It's time to
right.
put aside our differences.
We needed to declare our independence from fossil fuels.
Well, the big problem, though, is fear. So I think as this podcast goes on, I think we really need to work hard to get people to understand some of the nitty-gritty details on the safety aspects and why fear of nuclear energy is irrational, but that should be a different show.
Right, yeah. The benefits of nuclear power and the misconceptions of it can be an entire show. And, if safety stats on nuclear and pollution stats on it, and it's the best we can possibly get, honestly. And
I think we actually touched on a lot of things that are definitely, we get a lot of reaction, which I would love to have podcasts on those reactions, those specific reactions. So if people have questions about that, they should definitely write into us and leave comments, and we can address them.
And please, any expert that knows more than we do, tell us if we've made any mistakes. We're all imperfect, and we're just trying to put our minds together and solve this problem.
Yeah, we're all here just to get a climate fix.
Well, thank you all for joining us in this episode. You can support us and our mission online at www.americansfornuclearenergy.org. We have a link to donate with PayPal under the Mobilize page. You can also purchase some A&E swag under our store page. This will really help us pay for the little things, especially online service fees, to keep our organization running. We are a group of almost 10 volunteers at the moment. If you want to support this podcast specifically, you can donate on a per-episode basis at patreon.com. Link in the description.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, and YouTube. Lastly, we really want your feedback. Let us know your thoughts, questions, and concerns. We have a message form on our website under the About section, or you can email us directly at main@americansfornuclearenergy, all one word, .org.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for tuning in to this episode again. The next podcast hopefully should come out sometime at the end of this month. This is Phil Ord
and DJ LeClaire
of A&E's Climate Fix podcast. We'll see you next time.